Welcome to Soulful Latte podcast, a weekly conversation between two sisters to help us and our virtual friends online, like yourselves, grow in life and in faith. We're your hosts. I am Qudsiyah.
And I am Samia. Welcome to episode 5. This episode was very difficult for us to record because the topic is so sensitive and it can actually evoke a lot of strong emotions from others. And the topic is about toxicity. One of the reasons why we were hesitant to talk about this topic was because I think for many of us, we have actually felt this. We've either been around this or we have witnessed this. And sometimes it's a little bit scary to touch it because it is so big and so vast. And other times it is so subtle. And so this whole gradient of toxicity is a little difficult to address. So we're going to do our best today and talk about our personal stories, how we dealt with it, how we saw it, and how we can overcome some of the feelings associated with it.
So before we get into today's topic, I just wanted to tell you that I can't believe it's episode 5 and we're almost halfway done for the season. Do you believe it's real?
No, it really isn't. I'm really excited to see how it's going to be received. I'm a little bit nervous about it. And then we're doing the middle of the season episode with such a heavy topic. So hopefully no one will be scared away from us.
Okay, let's get into the topic. So when I think of toxicity, I immediately think of what makes a situation toxic. What do you feel around toxicity? What are the signs of a toxic situation? And from personal experience, one thing that comes up for me is when I'm in a toxic situation, I often feel very inferior and there's a lot of self-doubt within me. I begin to question myself loads. And sometimes I end up feeling very, very horrible after, to be honest. Do you have any personal signs that you've experienced?
I think you said something really big, which is you feel horrible after. And I can totally relate to that. It's that aftertaste in your mouth. You're like, wait, it didn't seem as bad as it was. And then when that person leaves, you're like, oh my God, this is worse than I thought it was. And for me, I'm a person who really thinks after the fact. You know, a lot of people, sometimes you rehearse dialogues in your mind. So I am that rehearsed person. Like I rehearse stuff that never happened or will happen or has happened. And so a lot of the times when I'm in that situation, this is what I'm doing after. Oh, maybe I should have said this. Maybe I should have said this. Because I feel so bad of how the whole interaction happened. And so feeling inferior and worthless and just absolutely a little bit of self-loathing even can come into play. Because if you start believing what the person is saying, then it's like, oh, am I really that kind of a person? And a lot of self-doubt and self-loathing probably are two of them, what I would say.
Definitely. I'm that person that rehearses the conversations in my head over and over again. And then it always seems like I said something wrong or did something wrong. And I go back and think to myself, but why did I say that? Why did I have to say that? And you just start second guessing yourself. And sometimes I've been in situations where it's pointed out to me that I'm always doing something wrong, which in a toxic situation puts me immediately on the defense. My guard is so high. And then everything becomes like an attack almost. You're trying to defend everything that's being said about you. And honestly, that is just draining.
Yes, draining. That is a great word, Qudsiyah. And I can talk about my personal story. Obviously, it is very difficult to talk about your personal story because at the same time, you don't want to talk about someone else. And I don't want to make someone else feel bad either. But I do want to share a little bit of what I felt in the process and how I was able to recognize it was toxic and kind of get out of that situation. The entire process where this was taking place, I didn't recognize that I was being treated in a way that was not normal. That's not a normal interaction. I thought this is how people are. I thought that I was just giving my best to something because I wanted to. I didn't know that I was being cornered into doing everything. And I remember during that time, my husband used to tell me and warn me, and I just completely did not even listen to him in that. He was like, Samia, be careful. Samia, you're doing too much. Like he would tell me all these things, and I'm like, no, 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 I'm fine. They're great people. It's a great situation. And so I did all of that, and I gave as much as I could, until I began feeling a little bit of resentment and just a little bit of sadness, and really saying, I'm not feeling like I did in the beginning. I guess because situation eventually keeps getting worse and stronger and stronger. I was like, I'm not feeling that good as I did in the beginning about this. And so I decided to step away from it, in a very positive way. However, it kind of backfired because when you're in a situation, I think, when there's a lot of toxicity going on, I mean, it's like you're under someone's control, and you're walking someone's laid out path for you. And as soon as I'm rebelling, I'm like, oh no, no, I don't want to do this anymore. Well, there's going to be consequences if it's a controlling person. And so there were consequences. I was treated in a very it was such a negative situation, and it affected me for a whole year. My self-esteem was down. I was doubting everything. I didn't want to have any friends. I was just in a very situation where it just didn't feel good, and I didn't realize it until I left, basically.
What made you leave? What was that point where you felt like this is it? I'm done with this situation now, and this is something I need to do for myself. Was it very much with awareness, or did it just happen for you?
I actually have this habit where if I'm in interaction, I will speak with someone, and the conversation will happen. And like I mentioned before, I think about it later. So, I the moment where I said, okay, I don't feel comfortable with this anymore, I had been in part of a conversation where I was engaged. I was like, yeah, okay, sounds fine. But when I went back to it, it was just another feeling of just negativity, unappreciation, complete ignoring of my passions, and not even, like a lot of things happen where a lot of faults were ignored, and I felt a little bit of taken advantage of, basically. And I think it was a big step. It was a little bit of a, you can do it, Samia. You just, you're not feeling good, a lot of self talk. And I remember actually dealing with this really late at night. I couldn't sleep at nighttime. And I just said, you know what, I just can't do it. And it was a lot of that conversation in the head. And finally understanding I have to, or else I'm just going to continue feeling this way.
It takes so much courage to walk away from a situation that's so draining and so burdening, because it seems like it really took over your mental state as well and your emotional state. And yeah, it takes a lot of courage to do that. And as you were saying your story, a lot of different relationships came in my mind. Relationships from like friendships when I was younger. And I remember my mom used to tell me, be careful of this person, be careful of that person. And I would be the same. I'd just say, no, 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 it's fine. Like, they're so good people, it's fine. Nothing's wrong. Like, they treat me so well. But that isn't the personal story that I want to share. I just wanted to say that a lot came up for me as well. I think for me as well, I didn't know that there was a word for this kind of thing. I just thought the clash is normal. The clash is a result of my personality. The clash is a result of something I am doing wrong. Of course, that plays a part on your self-esteem and your self-worth. I think my journey to coming out of that was truly accepting myself for who I was, because I feel like I was very much under the control of certain people when I didn't know myself, and therefore I didn't have opinions. I was very indecisive. So whatever they said, I went with it. I felt bad for not wanting to do something that I didn't want to do. But later on, after I accepted myself and got to know that actually it's okay to have your preferences, because they have their preferences as well. But yeah, after accepting myself, I think that I was able to know that it wasn't always me, if that makes sense. It's not always you. It's not always about you, you know?
When you mention self acceptance, so let's say that a person really accepts who she is, like I know who I am, but I still have to deal with that person who is toxic. how do you, I mean, for me, like I was able to completely get away from that situation. I was completely like, I don't even talk to, talk to any, so I'm not even exposed to any of that anymore. But let's say a person who is, let's say that I wasn't able to leave, and I knew for me it was uncomfortable, I didn't like it. How would I deal with it if I have to see that person over and over again?
This is, yeah, it's definitely a tricky one. I think for me, after I accepted myself and said, okay, so it's okay that you're indecisive. It's okay that you can't say no, but you're trying, and kind of be gentle with myself in developing my character. I think for me, it was to accept that that person and every other person has their own things to deal with, and they're having like their own kind of tests and their own insecurities and their own journey. And it's not always about me. And whenever something comes up, it's not always that the negativity is caused by me, because that way I felt like I was taking on all of their tests and all of their burden and putting it on myself, when in fact everyone has their own. And for me, it was freeing to know that it wasn't always me and I could just go on and do my own thing and have mental space. I stopped taking things personally. It really helped me change perspective in that before I used to think about it a lot. I used to think about, as I said, what I said, what they said, what did they mean, why did they say that, why did they say that in that tone? It was around many people. Now, what do those other people think of me? Now, my reputation has been like this. And now, how do I resolve it? It's just not such a nice place to be in when you think that many thoughts. So it was really, really freeing for me.
So a lot of it definitely has to do with accepting yourself and realizing that the other person is doing things because of their personal situations, and that has nothing to do with you.
I also want to say that this isn't saying that you don't have anything that you bring to a situation. So you might be toxic yourself, for example, or you might have some things that you're doing that are causing something. Also, being in charge of what you're saying and know when you're bringing something to a situation and when you're just acting out of your personality.
So the balance has to be drawn in realizing if you're the one at fault or if the other person is the one who's instigating the situation. I think when we're talking about toxicity and people who are toxic, that's a default. That's why they are toxic. That even if, let's say, your reaction to what they say is very negative, it's still going to be overpowered by their dominance, by their narcissism. It's always going to be them who's creating this environment where sometimes my own bad self is coming out. The bad things about myself are now being coming out. I didn't even know I had them. But now I'm just in such a negative situation where I'm having negative thoughts, I'm having negative conversations, I'm just angry. And as a result, I'm doing something that may not be good for my soul. And it might be fixed if I was just to remove myself from that environment.
One very important thing that I also want to mention is that toxicity comes in different levels. So I did a bit of reading on toxicity and some of the signs that show you that you're around toxic people. I noticed quite extremes, and that made me think that there's so many different levels as there are to anything on toxicity. So the page I was reading said things like, these people try to intimidate you to get their way. They control you by guilt tripping. They're very easily jealous. They see themselves constantly as a victim. They give backhanded compliments. They have no respect for boundaries. And they're very self-absorbed.
It hits the nail on the head for me. If I'm thinking of like a psychological situation or a therapeutic situation where someone is talking to someone about this, it's really important to know what signs to look for. And maybe those signs won't be as glaringly obvious, but I don't see any of these signs being prevalent in a person that I love and who loves me. They don't show any of these signs. So for me to see that, even in a small level, I'm bothered by it.
Before we started recording, we're speaking about how nothing ever becomes that big and that there's a difference between toxicity and abuse. We said that it's all the little things that add up towards making something big. So even if toxicity is defined like this, that's quite a high level of toxicity, but there's also mild levels. But it still makes us conscious of what toxicity is like and where it can go.
I wonder if, no one is born in a specific kind of a person. It's the choices that make them who they are, right? And so I wonder if in a relationship where it's new and maybe that person is developing these toxic tendencies and even they may not even know it, but it's something that they're just doing. And I wonder if me just taking it, not giving them any feedback, kind of empowers them to really work on those negative traits. So in the end, by the time where they're fully like developed into this toxic person, they know what to do to get whatever they want out of me because I've allowed that and I've kind of helped train them to be there. When we do talk about companionship and relationship as Muslims and as believers in our sisterhood and brotherhood situation, we check ourselves, we check each other like that. If you're my friend and I notice you doing something a little bit negative to another person, I'm going to be like, oh, let's talk about a situation that happened. This is what I noticed. This is what it felt like. I noticed how the other person was suddenly, I don't know, quiet after what happened. So I think I would probably talk to you about it. But then it only depends if you're receptive to my advice. And I think that when a person is on that path to a toxicity, they start shutting those advices and those good sounds out. And they maybe only surround themselves with people who are, like say yes all the time to them. I'm not sure. But I do feel very comfortable in laying the blame of their actions on them. Because there's a point where they decided that I'm going to say this so that I can make her feel this way.
Honestly, I just find it really scary, and communication helps a lot, and it depends on what level your communication actually is or your relationship is. Because you're right, when a person starts becoming very toxic, they are not so much receptive to any kind of communication from you. We've touched on different levels of toxicity. With the level of toxicity that we can actually control, what do we do with that?
Well, I feel like what you mentioned before about mental space is very important. I think that's probably the first step to take in any sort of a relationship which is toxic, whether it's really close or is far away, is understanding that that person is toxic and that person is making you feel this way and it's not your fault. So I think once you understand that difference, then you can say, okay, what steps do I need to take that are appropriate for me to handle this toxic relationship?
So, where you can't physically distance yourself from them, you distance yourself mentally and create that barrier. I find it's really important to create some kind of barrier because honestly, toxicity really, really, really has an impact on us. And when you think about it, it has an impact on our souls and our heart and even the state, mostly the state of our well being. And it's so important to create some barrier where you're not allowing all of that toxicity to come inside of you.
I think what I mentioned before about that it brings out the worst in you, and that's where your soul is being affected. So this idea of distancing yourself either mentally or physically is an act of self-love that I feel that you have a right to. It's one of the rights that you have on your body. You have to preserve your soul. You have to preserve your heart. And if you're in a situation where you're constantly being attacked and your worst characteristics are coming out, well, that needs to be addressed before you even become a person no one wants to be around.
It's definitely important to prioritize your own well being and your own well being of your heart. Be conscious and aware of what that situation is bringing out for you. That is one of the things that we can do as much as we can in our own situations.
I do want to interject a little bit here and just say that some relationships we have the power to do that, where once we realize it, we're able to get away from it. And some it is more difficult, it is more delicate. It's a very delicate situation where it might be maybe it's your parents who are toxic, it might be your spouse is toxic, or even your siblings might be toxic. And that's where things become really difficult. And I think at that time, some sort of a professional guidance is necessary. Someone who knows what they're talking about to help you deal with this and find out the solution that's best for you. Talking about prioritizing yourself, I think it's really easy to fall into the trap of, am I being selfish? And that's actually something that a toxic person will tell you. You're being selfish. because you're choosing to do things that you want to do and you're ignoring that what you don't want to do. Obviously, there's a level in that in itself. But I just want to say that there's a healthy level of selfishness, and don't be that toxic voice to yourself. If you're feeling uncomfortable in a situation, you're like, I don't really want to take part of it. Don't be that person who's like, oh, don't be selfish. Like another person's already telling you that. Don't allow yourself to play that role too. So it's okay to be a little selfish where you're prioritizing your health, mental, emotional, and spiritual. It's so important to give yourself that permission.
Before recording this, Samia and I had lengthy conversations about this whole topic. And of course, we're just speaking from personal experience. And I hope that it's just given you something to think about. Because truly, you can only be of service to others when you are giving yourself something and when you have enough in you to give. Where you're taking care of yourself and filling your own cup, and that's the only way that you can fill other people's cup.
Apart from, obviously separating yourself and finding a way to create a barrier, I think a way to really deal with this is focus on doing things that bring you happiness, that really lighten your passions, and giving yourself a space to just, a safe space to enjoy the things that you like to do. Because I feel when you're around that toxic person a lot, they make you feel so inferior and so bad all the time that you don't find joy in life anymore. So if you can just find a little space where you're just really enjoying whatever you're doing, and that will probably help to fill that cup that you mentioned, that you have, a lot of happiness in you, and you're like, okay, I can share it now. But if there's nothing that you enjoy in life, then it becomes really difficult to separate yourself from that person.
Definitely. So making more space for things that energize us and nourish us, and learning to say no to things that drain us and make us feel lower than the status that Allah has given us.
Just to end this podcast, I think a lot of what we said may trigger some of you, or may really elicit a strong response, and that's not really what we intend to do. However, we do want to listen to it. How did this episode make you feel? How do you see yourself in a situation where a person has been toxic around you? Were you able to deal with it? And how did you deal with it? We would love to hear that from you. So please do share that with us.
I know that we've touched on a few big things, and honestly, for the both of us, it's been a very difficult episode to record, maybe the most difficult one yet. We had to think a lot about what we wanted to say, and we're just praying that it came out in the intended way. If there's something that you've benefited from today, we'll be so grateful if you would share it with someone you know and subscribe to the podcast. You can also contact us at Soulful Latte Podcast on Instagram, or write to us at soulfullattepodcast@gmail.com. We would really love to hear from you. Until next time, keep growing.